G'day, listeners. You are listening to the Natives Rouseabout podcast. I'm your host, Michael, and today I've got Mitch with me to discuss the place of Norman Lindsay's book, The Magic Pudding in Australian Culture, and to also look at some of Norman Lindsay's philosophy of art from his creative effort. How you going, Mitch?
I'm going very well, Mick. How about yourself?
Yeah, pretty good. Just taking it easy. Got a beer. Nice light topic today with children's literature, but we'll see how we go. We might get into some deeper stuff as well. But you recently went to the national convention for the association. Is that right?
I did. And the parochial cabbage patcher in me, Mick, feels an obligation to say that the national convention and AGM in Victoria last year was, of course, the best of all time, and it won't be topped until Victoria hosts it again. But I have to give credit where it's due. The boys in Canberra did a fantastic job this year. I'm a big Burley Griffin appreciator, and that they really showed us the best that Canberra had to offer. But I think what has really buoyed my spirits and got me feeling really positive about the future of the organisation coming out of this is just the quality of guys that were there. It's obviously been a really big year for the organisation. We've expanded from those initial branches in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Canberra Monaro to now have branches obviously in Sydney, in Hobart, in Adelaide. We've got associate members from about as far north Queensland as you can go. The mid-north coast of New South Wales, the south coast of New South Wales that were all present, and really good quality guys, family men, many of them, very skilled in their respective professions and bringing a lot to the table in that respect. So, yeah, I'm really excited about the future of the organisation, and I'll put it out there to listeners. If you're thinking about getting involved, or you've even had thoughts about trying to get your own branch up and running, I think there's never been a better time. I'm pretty excited about how things are looking.
Yeah, big white pill. So don't sit there embracing the black pill. It's definitely much better to meet guys who are of the same mindset and have some interesting conversations like we hopefully will have today.
Absolutely.
The main focus is, of course, the magic pudding. And I know you know a bit about this one, Mitch. I probably didn't read it when I was a kid. Not that I remember. So I've only just refreshed myself on this one. But maybe you can tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, very happy to, Mick. Yeah, I've done a bit of a refresh myself in the last few days, but I must admit I was a bit of a latecomer to the Magic Pudding as well. I didn't read it until probably only a few years ago for the very first time. And look, it is branded as a children's book, but it's a children's book that clearly was intended to amuse and delight the adults that would have been reading it to the children at the time more than 100 years ago. It is genuinely one of the funniest books that I have ever read. And just to give you a little bit of an insight into that and an overview of the comic absurdity of it, it follows the story of Bunyip Bluegum, an aristocratic or at least a well-bred young koala who unfortunately can't stand living with his Uncle Wattleberry for a moment longer because Uncle Wattleberry, believing his whiskers, his ever-growing whiskers to give him this sense of great dignity, has allowed them to grow so much that there's no room for Bunyip Bluegum in the house anymore. So he sets off to be a man of leisure. Unfortunately, his stomach and his appetite gets the better of him. He didn't think about that, but he's lucky enough to run into Bill Barnacle and Sam Thornoff, a sailor and a penguin, respectively, a penguin bold, in fact, who have this magical pudding that not only, this anthropomorphic pudding, I might add, which not only regenerates itself and can change flavours, but also has this zeal for being eaten, wants to be eaten constantly. And all sorts of shenanigans ensue when they run into those dastardly pudding thieves in the possum and the wombat. And it's basically just a series of adventures and run-ins between Bunyip Bluegum, who always proves to save the day, and his friends Bill Barnacle and Sam Thornoff, and the wicked and dastardly possum and wombat who try to steal the pudding at every opportunity. But it is a very, very funny book. You'll probably have to do most of the heavy lifting as far as Norman Lindsay's philosophy goes, I think. But for all things Magic Pudding, I'm here and very happy to contribute.
Yeah, well, first impressions for me, like the level of the language is quite high, I think, and that's I think that's something that's very important when we're looking at exposing the next generations to literature and to art. That kids' material, kids' books and movies and so on, yeah, they need to be pitched at a certain level, but it's always best when they have, I think, some depth to them that kids can reread and get more and more out of it. And even, as you say, there's something in there for the adults. And it's been said by some people that this is a very Australian or pro-Australian, very ochre sort of book. But on the other hand, there's this idea that there's a sort of a subtle critique of Australia going on as well. And that's something that I think will be interesting to get into as we go. But before we get too far, we'd better go through the regular rituals. There is a listener comment from a couple of shows ago now, but we're doing more regular shows. So sometimes it's not going to be covering the comments from the previous show, but from one a couple back. But this is from the show Exploring the Australian Legend. And Kyle Smith said, I enjoy the discussions and the literature that you guys highlight. I write a little here and there. Poetry seems to be inspiring me recently. I have early memories of my dad and grandfather reciting Lawson and Patterson. Never understood why we never studied them in high school or university literature classes. Keep doing what you're doing. Regards from Gippsland. Yeah, so a nice little comment there, and hopefully you appreciate the discussion. All right.
Yeah.
Anything from you, Mitch, on that?
Oh, just it's heartwarming stuff, isn't it, to hear about fathers or grandfathers reading Lawson or Patterson to their sons. In terms of why it's not studied at school or university, there was certainly a time when it was. I mean, on the one hand, we have always suffered from this cultural cringe, haven't we, where the academics and the elitists among us have tended to look down upon Australian poetry, bush poetry in particular. But on the other hand, it was certainly popular enough that I know my parents back in the 70s studied it in school. I think part of it comes from probably not just this looking down upon Australian culture, but this broader kind of dismantling of anything that's remotely patriarchal or colonial or imperial or anything like that. So that's part of it, or at least that's what initially drove it. I think a big part of why more traditional forms of poetry, particularly structured poetry, are not studied or what prevents them from being revived is the fact that people don't really know how to scan poetry anymore. Free verse tends to dominate in schools and universities. None of that's ideological, but I think part of it is because even teachers and lecturers have lost that understanding of how to actually scan poetry for meter and understand the effects of different meters and subtle variations in meter. And that's a key part of actually being able to properly analyse Australian bush poetry, which is generally pretty highly structured. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah, it's probably connected with that broader, I guess, move away from structures and post-structuralism and this sort of chaotic approach to culture, breaking things down rather than maintaining this Chesterton's fences. Anyway, speaking of meter and verse, we have a poem from Norman Lindsay, and this one is called The Sad Fate of Gamboge Bluegum. Now, the character from The Magic Pudding is Bunyip Bluegum, who is a koala bear, but Norman Lindsay, not just an author, of course, but probably more famous as an artist. He did many drawings, I guess, or sketches, cartoons of koala bears, and he had many of these characters, and this particular one is Gamboge Bluegum. So I'll have a little read of this one, and then perhaps we can discuss it, because I think this poem is also an interesting or a good introduction to Lindsay himself and some of his views. So the poem is The Sad Fate of Gamboge Bluegum. Gamboge Bluegum, the artist bear, wore on his brow the signs of care. He said, I am sick of these clothes we wear. I will paint the bear as he should be, bare. So he called his model and painted her in a natural, simple state of fur. The socially pure, they heard what he swore. They came and they peered through a crack in the door. And they said with groans, he is painting her in a horrible state of sin and fur. In short, they raised such a great uproar that they harrowed young Bluegum's soul to the core. And in order to show where his sin did lurk, they poked umbrellas through Bluegum's work. They said, 'tis a slur on the name of bear, to hint that under our clothes we wear a pair of legs all covered with hair. 'Tis to mark us down as humanity's dregs, to hint that bears have hairy legs. To be quite precise, it is only fair to mention the fact that we're well aware that the stuff bears wear is fur, not hair. So now young Bluegum, full of care, his wage from a fatuous world to tear, must paint the horrible clothes bears wear, for society says no bear should dare to paint a bear entirely. That was The Sad Fate of Gamboge Bluegum. What is your impression of that poem, Mitch?
Very much autobiographical, isn't it? Yeah, this is the world in which Norman Lindsay lived, reprimanded and censored for his work, which certainly pushed the boundaries of social norms and conventions of the time in terms of its explicitness. Yeah, look, it's a clever technique, I think, using the koala bear. Obviously, the idea of a koala being naked or unclothed, seeming scandalous, versus a koala with clothing on seeming appropriate is quite ridiculous. And by using the koala, he's obviously trying to make the same point about the wowsers, as he called them, effectively condemning what is natural. But yeah, it's an interesting one, and Lindsay's philosophy generally is very interesting, and I know you're going to dive into that. And for me, without knowing it all that well, to the extent that I do know it, I'm probably somewhat conflicted about it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So I'll yeah, we obviously have to talk about anti-modernism and anti-feminism, but then obviously how that ties in with this anti-wowser element. We kind of see a lot of these things coming together here. Look, it's certainly an amusing poem, but yeah, it probably also betrays aspects of Lindsay's worldview philosophy that yeah, I'm a little bit ambivalent to, I suppose.
yeah. So for perhaps a bit more context for those listeners who don't know all the terminology or what Lindsay was known for, Lindsay's art was very known for sort of these positive portrayals of nudity, sex, sort of so-called lewd material, in a manner that was sort of similar to people like D.H. Lawrence, although Lindsay himself said he had a different a view on it than Lawrence did. But he can sort of be compared with Lawrence in the reaction and censorship of their work. So for one of Lindsay's famous artworks is called Venus Crucified, which it does also include some of that sort of Nietzschean element of his work as well, because obviously he is critiquing Christianity and Christ in that by replacing Christ with the Venus, which is the god of love, or goddess of love rather, and she's painted nude on the cross with her breasts out. And the idea is that the wowser culture, so this sort of Christian pious culture, has created this really repressive, negative attitude towards the body and towards sex. And you get that Nietzschean element there, right? The resentment of the slave morality towards the people who are natural, healthy, and beautiful. So that positive approach to the world, I suppose, or that very world affirming approach in that Nietzschean sense. And yeah, the wowsers obviously are the Christians in society, defined amusingly by C.J. Dennis as wowser, an ineffably pious person who mistakes this world for a penitentiary and himself for a warder. So I
It,
suppose a similar attitude towards the wowser running there through C.J. Dennis's mind.
it's a good line, isn't it? And look, I think even for myself as a Christian, looking at that really stifling and kind of repressive Victorian era morality, I can look at that and say, yeah, that goes too far. But I suppose the counter argument to that is, well, the slippery slope is real, right? Where we're seeing the effects of where the slippery slope has led us once you start peeling back some of those layers of moral conservatism and social conservatism, and yeah, it's a slippery slope down to outright degeneracy, which we're kind of living in right now. So it's a fine line. It's not something that I've spent a whole lot of time thinking about exactly where the boundary lies between what's kind of acceptable pushing of the boundaries and what goes too far. But clearly, we're well past that point in the present day.
Yeah, I think the telling point for me about the modern sort of pornographic culture is the sterility of it. I mean, you can't say that you are, I think, world or life affirming. And then you have these pickup artists who sleep with, 2,000 women and, have no children, or they've got, a few half Filipino children here and a few, Thai children over there and South American children overseas that they don't know. So that, to me, that's obviously a kind of sterile view. And then you've got all the women who are having all these abortions. So there's when it's leading to death, I think that's the Christian. There is like a Christian appropriation of nature, right? Because the idea is that Christ has come to give us life and life more abundantly. And this isn't really the association isn't a religious association, but when we're talking about Nietzsche, we do need to talk, I think, about some of these issues. So I think there is something the Christian can gain from looking at Nietzsche and some of his critiques, the excessive repression, as he said. But let's move on from the poem. Oh, well, the only other thing I'd say there, the Nietzschean element, that the line that stuck out to me was that young blue gum full of care, his wage from a fatuous world to tear must paint the horrible clothes bears wear. Sort of a more of an indictment, I suppose, of this sort of bourgeois world where you have to.
Yeah, we potentially comes into how some of his philosophy is conveyed through the magic pudding, if we accept some of these Nietzschean interpretations of his work.
Yes, yes. All right, but before we get to the magic pudding, a very brief biographical sketch of Norman Lindsay himself, just so we can situate him in time a bit and in place. But he was born in Creswick, Victoria, on the 22nd of February, 1879. The fifth of 10 children, all of whom had artistic talents and spurred each other on in their artistic efforts as they grew up. So a very important dynasty, really, in Australian art, the dynasty. Being born in a mining town, Lindsay did have a lot of experience with the Chinese, and he'd go down to see the Chinese and kind of laugh at their strange ways. So he did have, I think, from a very early age, these sort of racial views. The sort of culture he was exposed to in his family was more European high culture, so sort of classical Renaissance style culture, which also shaped, I think, his viewpoint, even though when we're looking at works like, this about koala bears, anthropomorphic koala bears and wombats and stuff, it does seem very, very Australian and down to earth and sort of localist in his ideals. And if you look at a lot of his other artwork, it's very classical. Anyway, through his life, so he started writing for the Bulletin in 1901, the year of Federation. So, of course, writing for the Bulletin or rather doing a lot of sketching and art for the Bulletin primarily, he would have been exposed to that Bulletin culture of the bush poets, and the Bulletin being the Bushman's Bible is definitely exposed to that side of things, which I think we can see a lot more as well when we're talking about the Australian elements in his work. During the Great War, he created propaganda posters for the government, which was contributing to the war effort with his art. But he did lose a younger brother in the Great War as well in 1916. And then the Magic Pudding was published first in 1918 at the end of the war. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we look at the book. And for a children's book, it's a very violent book, really. Funnily enough, I don't know. Did you notice that reading through it, Mitch?
The violence,
yeah.
I mean, it's treated in a fairly comical sort of way. I hadn't really stopped to think about the fact that this is unusually violent for a children's book. I suppose I was mostly caught up in thinking about what is unusual for a children's book. The same thing that you touched on before, that the style of writing and the language and sophistication of the verse is really quite unexpected for something that's marketed at children. And I think that's what drives a lot of the humor as well. There's this incongruity between the absurdity of the subject matter and this grand, stately, almost neoclassical poetry style. So I think I was so caught up in that I never really stopped to think about it. It's pretty violent for a children's book, but you make a good point. It is. There's a lot of biffo.
Yeah, and I think looking at it, the vast majority of the violence is initiated by the protagonists as well. So, whereas
a bit to say on that, I'm sure, when we dive into it.
And anyway, so back to the biographical points. The other work we'll touch on briefly, and to be honest, I didn't read through all of it, but his long essay, Creative Effort, published in 1924, and it was the work that set out his vision for Australian art, and would be influential on, well, for one thing, his son, who, you would expect he knew his son well, but he didn't, because he was a bit of a womanizer. So he was sort of off in Sydney while his son was growing up elsewhere, and his son only came to his work later, really. His son was inspired by Creative Effort, and his son Jack Lindsay's friend as well, P.R. Stevenson, who some people might have heard of. was also inspired by this effort, but by this essay. But yes, Creative Effort published in 1924, The Vision for Australian Art. He would go on to create this publication, not very successful, called Vision as well. Beyond that, Lindsay published several sort of scandalous novels. One of them was heavily censored, which created a lot of publicity around it. Sort of, I think he intentionally did that to promote his work. And he would live for quite a while, continuing to create art, and passed away in 1969. So that's a really short sketch of his biography, but hopefully that gives listeners an idea of where he was coming from. So this is, I think, a point for you to discuss. But how did this book come about? The magic pudding. What's the story behind a book being written about an anthropomorphic pudding?
Well, my understanding of it, and I think you've touched on this as well, is that it was a bet between Norman Lindsay and one of his friends, Richard Stevens, might have been, as to what was more likely to win over children. And Stevens said, "Oh, fairies and fantasy and these things." And Norman Lindsay, I guess, said that much like the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, a way to a children's heart, or the way to a children's heart, a children's. I'll try that again. The way to a child's heart is through his stomach as well, and said that if you want to get kids interested in books, food, and fighting, and the magic pudding was born from that. And I was always amused by that little origin story. Had never thought about the book in terms of political worldview, and in some respects, it kind of seems absurd to think about a children's book as advancing some kind of political worldview or making some kind of deep social commentary. And yet, even though I'd probably challenge maybe some of the assertions that have been made in regards to the points that Lindsay was making, there are definitely some things there that you look at it and straight away, instinctively, the thing that is funny about it is that it's clearly lampooning or satirising some element of Australian society, and so that has to be intentional.
Yeah, I think when we get to the genesis of the pudding as well, we'll see how the pudding is a sort of an ambivalent character there. So I think we've actually covered quite a few of these points already through the natural course of discussion. Perhaps we should jump into some excerpts from the book, and then we can sort of get a bit deeper into parts. How does that sound?
Yep, I like it. Let's do it.
Right. So let's go to the point where he first discovers his need for food, because he's just left. You provided that overview of the book. He's left home, and he's inquired of his poet friend whether he should be a traveller or a swagman. But since he's got neither a bag nor a swag, the poet says he should be a gentleman of leisure and stroll about with a stick. And we get some nice illustrations there of him walking very gentlemanly with his boater hat and gentleman's stick. But then he discovers a problem. So this is page 18. Unfortunately, in the hurry of leaving home, he had forgotten to provide himself with food, and at lunchtime found himself attacked by the pangs of hunger. "Dear me," he said, "I feel quite faint. I had no idea that one's stomach was so important. I have everything I require except food, but without food, everything is rather less than nothing. I've got a stick to walk with. I've got a mind to think with. I've got a voice to talk with. I've got an eye to wink with. I've lots of teeth to eat with, a brand new hat to bow with, a pair of fists to beat with, a rage to have a row with. No joy it brings to have indeed a lot of things one does not need. Observe my doleful plight, for here am I without a crumb to satisfy a raging tum. Oh, what an oversight." And as he was indulging in these melancholy reflections, he came round a bend in the road and discovered two people in the very act of having lunch. These people were none other than Bill Barnacle, the sailor, and his friend Sam Sawnoff, the penguin bold. So this is the point where he comes across the noble society of pudding owners. What do you think about this? Do you think there's a meaning to this? Because I have some thoughts on it.
Well, it's fortuitous for one thing that right at the moment he thought his hunger was going to get the better of him, that he should run into Bill Barnacle and Sam Thornoff, the penguin bold, who happened to have this magic ever replenishing pudding. So quite fortunate indeed. But yeah, I think looking ahead to what plays out throughout the text, Bunyip Bluegum is clearly on with his good breeding. And intelligence, he's clearly on a level above the rather hapless at times Bill Barnacle and Sam Sornoff. And he comes up with all these ingenious schemes for getting the pudding back, because in their foolishness they've ended up falling for a very obvious ruse of possum and wombat. So he's the brains of the whole operation. And yes, looking at it through this philosophical lens, I suppose you can get the sense that it's too bad that Bunyip has to spend this intelligence and cultivation that's a product of his status and his good breeding on the common everyday struggles of a man simply trying to fill his belly. And if only he had more noble things he could pursue, if he didn't have to share those common concerns of the masses, I suppose, whose primary occupation or the main thing that they're focused on is, what am I eating today? So yeah, I suppose that's probably my main observation from that.
Yeah, and we can draw, I think, some evidence for that view from his book Creative Effort as well, because he makes this distinction right at the start of that book between life and existence. And he says life is basically just the body and everything that serves its need, right? The masses, all they care about is bread and circuses, sort of thing. And so I think it is telling that he's come from this point where he's been talking with his poet friend, and he's got this idea of being a gentleman of leisure, and then he's going to run into these sort of lower class characters and be consumed with thoughts of food for the rest of the book till the end. So yes, that is the level of existence, as opposed to what Lindsay considered to be life, which is the mind and art and creation of new ideas. Not so much utilitarian sort of ideas like scientific technological knowledge that makes life more comfortable. But for him, the value is in, I guess, that literally creative effort or creative vision. So the work of a Beethoven or a Mozart who sort of elevates people into a higher culture.
Yeah, it's a good connection, a good tie-in between that extract from Creative Effort. I think, yeah, relevant connection, well made.
Yeah, but speaking of the noble pudding owners, as I did, we get a bit of subversion of that idea as well, which again is one of those elements of the book that I think is quite deep, and it also reflects on, I think it gives us a bit more of a perspective on how we should view the pudding if we think about it, and also how we should view these characters that Bunyip Bluegum's about to join up with. So this is pages a bit further on, pages 24 to 27, and we get this story from Bill Barnacle as to how they came across and took possession of this pudding, this magic pudding, in the first place. And it goes like this. Ho, the cook of the saucy sausage was a fella called Curry and Rice, a son of a gun as fat as a ton, with a face as round as a hot cross bun, or a barrel to be precise. One winter's morn we rounds the horn, a rollin' homeward bound. We strikes on the ice, goes down in a trice, and all on board but Curry and Rice, and me and Sam is drowned. For Sam and me and the cook, you see, we climbs on a lump of ice, and there in the sleet we suffered a treat for several months from frozen feet, with nothing at all but ice to eat, and ice does not suffice. And Sam and me, we couldn't agree with the cook at any price. We was both as thin as a piece of tin, while that there cook was busting his skin on nothing to eat but ice. Says Sam to me, it's a mystery more deep than words can utter. Whatever we do, here's me and you, us both as thin as Irish stew, while he's as fat as butter. But late one night we wakes in fright to see by a pale blue flare that cook has got in a phantom pot a big plum duff and rump and steak hot, and the guzzling wizard is eating the lot on top of the iceberg bear. And then Bill says there's a verse left out here, stopping the song, owing to the difficulty of explaining exactly what happened when me and Sam discovered the deceitful nature of that cook. The next verse is as follows. Now Sam and me can never agree what happened to Curry and Rice. The whole affair is shrouded in doubt, for the night was dark and the flare went out, and all we heard was a startled shout, though I think myself in the subsequent rout, that us being thin and him being stout, in the middle of pushing and shoving about, he must have fell off the ice. That won't do, you know, began the puddin', but Sam said hurriedly, it was very dark, and there's no saying at this day what happened. Yes, there is, said the puddin', for I had my eye on the whole affair, and it's my belief that if he hadn't been so round, you'd have never rolled him off the iceberg, for he was both singing out yo heave ho for half an hour and him trying to hold on to Bill's beard. So I'll leave it there. But so basically, a few interesting pieces of information here. The pudding is created by a fella called Curry and Rice, which I think may be of some significance. And it's also been claimed through an act of violence, which in the circumstances would constitute, it seems, murder. So noble pudding owners, question mark. For me, I think, because here's the thing: when this book is analysed, a lot of thought is usually put into, what's the meaning of the magic pudding? Now, this pudding that constantly replenishes, it's sort of a symbol, like alludes maybe to this classical idea of a cornucopia, right? A horn of plenty that constantly provides you with food. And so people have said maybe this is meant to be, maybe this sort of ochre pudding is a symbol of Australia as this new land of plenty. But I do think the reading that doesn't see the pudding as Australian has got something to say for it, because obviously it's originated outside of Australia on this ship, and it's been created by somebody whose name to me, suggests India, obviously, curry and rice. So for me, the pudding, I definitely think it probably does have that negative connotation of just being something to fill the belly. Like the pudding would more represent a multicultural food truck than perhaps Australia as a land of plenty. But what do you think about that, Mitch?
Interesting one. I think if you were going to make the argument that it represents Australia as this land of plenty, and the humour comes from the absurdity of them fighting over. This is Bill and Sam and Bunyip versus Possum and Wombat fighting over this thing that they can quite easily share because it keeps regenerating. That kind of lends itself to the question of the unspoken question of, well, why is there struggle within Australia? Can't we have this egalitarian kind of society where people are actually sharing the bountiful treasures, I guess, that Australia has to offer? But even though they're violent characters and they initiate the violence a lot of the time, they initiate the violence against curry and rice, and yes, there definitely be some Asiatic or possibly subcontinental influence there. They initiate the violence against him. They're outraged at him keeping that from them. But then when somebody else in Possum and Wombat, or two others in Possum and Wombat, are equally outraged at them keeping the pudding to themselves, they defend it as strongly as they can. It sort of seems to give this kind of might is right perspective. Where we barracked for Sam Sornoff and Bill Barnacle and Bunyip to prevail over Possum and Wombat. We don't sit there thinking, can't they share it with these guys? We want them to win, even though if we stop and think about it, they're probably not behaving all that well. They're certainly not being very generous. So I don't know, maybe you can square the two things. Like the magic pudding is Australia, but there's this kind of might is right view that's being endorsed, which I'm certainly no expert in Nietzsche, but does this align with the idea of the Superman and the tearing down of
to some extent, like
Christian morality?
There is an element of that in Nietzsche, right, where life is will to power and the ability to, I suppose, hold power over somebody else, right? That does create the master slave sort of dialectic in as Nietzsche has it. Sort of, I've been reading a lot of Hegel, and I'm starting to use the word dialectic, and perhaps inappropriately now. This dichotomy between the master and the slave, where you have the master morality, which is about having that, I suppose, health and vitality and beauty and strength and ability to be ambitious and to have your way in the world and to create beautiful things. Whereas the slave is that resentful person who wants to tear down the master and sees the master as evil for oppressing him. And what is good is this sharing and all that sort of stuff. So since there is no sharing there is an element, I suppose, of Nietzsche's master morality perhaps at play in the main characters. I think it's certainly the way the story is framed subverts a kind of more traditional idea of morality behind the pudding owners, because we do see, as you know as well, that the pudding owners are originally pudding thieves themselves. So there is this sort of relativization, and I think as well parts of the story tend to send up traditional sort of forms like patriotic anthems and that sort of thing. So you have on page 44 this verse, the Puddin' Owners Anthem, that they all sing when Bunyip Bluegum joins with them, and he magically knows it as well for some reason. But it goes, the solemn word is plighted, the solemn tale is told. We swear to stand united, three puddin' owners bold. When we with rage assemble, let puddin' snatchers groan. Let puddin' burglars tremble, they'll now our pudding own. Hurrah for puddin' owning, hurrah for friendship's hand. Just the puddin' thieves are groaning to see our noble band. Hurrah, we'll stick together and always bear in mind to eat our puddin' gallantly whenever we're inclined. So you do have this anthem quality to it, with this idea of a solemn word and a pledge. We're assembling a group of hurrah for friendship's hand, our noble band, and we're eating the pudding gallantly. But it is really a send up of that whole idea of a noble society or fraternity, or even a sort of a national anthem. And later on, you have sort of the misuse of God Save the King, where the pudding thieves have hidden the pudding under a hat, and Bunyip Bluegum said, God Save the King, so that they all have to take their hats off and reveal that the pudding's been stolen. So I think there is that parody of nobility in a lot of it. What do you take out of that?
Yeah, that second example that you mentioned, I guess you could argue that there's a parody of nobility and God Save the King being misused for devious ends there. Equally, probably my first impression of that, and that's a point where the humour is very clearly grounded in social commentary, and so it automatically forces you to think, okay, what specifically is being said here, or at least very clearly grounded in satire. I was probably more focused on the response of the wombat and the possum. They say, oh no, there's nothing we can do now. We have to take our hats off because they're singing God Save the Queen. There's no way that we could possibly resist that. And then as a result, they come undone, and the pudding is regained by Sam, Bill, and Bunyip. I guess I was probably more focused on the question of whether that is a criticism of blind patriotism and sort of just going along with what is expected in the name of king and country. But I think the counterpoint that you make, the way that patriotism can be misused, and it's not necessarily the noble thing that it is always made out to be. The Edmund Burke line, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Perhaps an element of that there as well.
Yeah. Should we go to the next thing that I selected, or is there anything you want to look at before we go to another part? Or?
No, not particularly. If there's time, once we've gone through the main points of social commentary here, they might just highlight, just because I think they're really funny, but that we can say that for later. That's fine.
Yeah, sure. I don't want to monopolize necessarily the selection too much, but there was another verse, or a poem on the use of violence, which is when they've been. Oh, this is literally that bit I was talking about. I'll go from the top of the page just so we get that then. So, hats off in honour to our king, shouted Bill, and off came all the hats. The pudding thieves, of course, were helpless. The wombat had to take his hat off or prove himself disloyal, and there was Puddin' sitting on his head. Now who's a liar, shouted Bill, hitting the possum a swinging blow on the snout, while Sam gave the wombat one of his famous overarm flip-flaps that knocked all the wind out of him. The wombat tried to escape punishment by shouting, "Never strike a man with a pudding on his head." But now that their guilt was proved, Bill and Sam were utterly remorseless, and gave the pudding thieves such a trouncing that their shrieks pierced the firmament. When this had been done, all hands gave them an extra thumping in the interests of common morality. Eggs were rubbed in their hair by Benjamin, and Bill and Sam attended to the beating and snout bending, while Bunyip did the reciting. Standing on a stump, he declaimed, "The blows you feel we do not deal in common vulgar thumping. To higher motives we appeal. It is to teach you not to steal. Your heads we now are bumping. You need not go on pumping appeals for kind of dealing. We like to watch you jumping. We like to hear you squealing. We rather think this thumping will take a bit of healing. We hope these blows upon the nose, these bended snouts, these tramped on toes, these pains that you are feeling, the truth will be revealing how wrong is puddin' stealing." I might just leave it there as well. But you have to, I suppose, again, question perhaps the idea that they're doing this in support of some higher morality, or common morality that they claim to be doing it for, because you also have that sort of I'm not sure what the word for it is, but we like to hear, we like to watch you jumping. We like to hear you squealing. We rather think this thumping will take a bit of healing, and so there's that sort of sadistic. I think the word is, yeah, sadistic element to it, perhaps.
Yeah. There's an element of sadism, I think, in the name of morality and teaching an important moral lesson. But ultimately, it's all pretty self-serving, isn't it? And it seems somewhat ridiculous that they do have this pudding that replenishes, and the very obvious solution is to just let anybody who wants some of it have some of it, because it's going to, not only does it replenish itself, but it actually demands to be eaten. The pudding is a pretty cantankerous fellow, and if its owners, whoever the present owners are, if they're not constantly eating him, he gets very unhappy. So yeah, it's rather absurd, this fight for the pudding. But at the same time, this is the interesting part. I think that we're made to barrack for Bill and Sam and Bunyip, and to barrack against Possum and Wombat. That's how I come away from the text feeling. So yeah, there's an interesting dynamic at play there.
Yeah, and I think another point towards the idea that the magic pudding is running a bit of critique here against Australia and perhaps other nations as well, given that the First World War just come to an end. Is I'll just do this excerpt from the other book, Creative Effort, the sort of philosophy book, because yes, Lindsay was heavily influenced by Nietzsche and this idea of perhaps like an intellectual elite and some sort of classical new Renaissance idea. But he wasn't a blind follower of everything in Nietzsche. And so there's this quote from page 19 of Creative Effort. He says, you place a part of German corruption at Nietzsche's door. I retort to you that it was the German who corrupted Nietzsche. No man detested the dull egotism of these German boors as Nietzsche did. No man heaped such scorn upon them. No man before the war or since has levelled at them such a terrible accusation. These blonde beasts, whose primal instinct of hatred has driven them from the beginning of history to attack human civilization. The will to power, the will to conquest. Did the German parrot echo these cries from Nietzsche? Or did Nietzsche echo them from the German? A great mind may outstrip its generation, but something of the mud of passage will cling to it. The action of all mental effort owes an obscure stimulus to those elements of its generation that react upon all mental effort. And that's the end of the quote there. But yeah, I don't think Lindsay didn't really see the will to conquest or warfare as the correct pathway for the creation of, I guess, this Superman sort of character that's going to elevate humanity to the next level. For him, that was the world of art and high culture. So that is definitely a departure from, I think, those elements of Nietzsche that are often embraced by the right. Because even that very quote that Lindsay selects there, or that allusion, these blonde beasts whose primal instinct of hatred, that is the sort of thing that the National Socialists elevated as their ideal, right? The idea of the blonde Aryan beast whose just vital power leads him to overthrow his enemies and conquest and this sort of thing. Whereas Lindsay is suggesting that this is something that perhaps Nietzsche has taken from the Germans rather than the other way around. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's an important qualification, and I did try to do a little bit of my homework, Mick, and read some of those excerpts that you provided me with, and I did read that one as you were reading it. Then I thought, oh yeah, that's right, I'd forgotten about that one. So that's an important qualification, and yeah, what he's talking about there does seem to be a pretty direct criticism of the kind of behaviour that the Bill Barnacle and Sam Sornoffs of the world tend to engage in. But it still leaves the question: why do we come away from the book sympathising with or barracking for them over Wombat and Puddin? At least that's how I feel. Am I misinterpreting that? Do you think, or are we meant to be kind of laughing at them?
I don't know. I think we are meant to. I think there's a question as to who is meant to be sympathetic with them and who isn't, because Lindsay is an elitist. So Lindsay does believe that this idea of creative effort, and he limited, I think, the publication of the book to like 100 copies or something with the first run of it, and he himself gave a lot of those copies to particular people. So he didn't necessarily expect his ideas to have mass appeal. I think it is telling this idea of the origin, or rather the story of the origin of the book, in this sort of question or debate as to whether people prefer fairies or fairy stories, or do they prefer stories about food. And when I think about a fairy story, what's a fairy? It's a supernatural sort of spiritual character, right? Depending on specific interpretation is, and what the nature of the story that the fairy appears in. Sometimes these days we get, I suppose, the typical image of a fairy, the tooth fairy or something, is this small, flitty little creature with small wings and so on. But in a lot of other poetry, they can be quite majestic or even dangerous creatures, right? The fae, and dangerous perhaps as well. So I think when he's engaging in that question, what do people prefer? Maybe there are the noble, aristocratic minds who might prefer the spiritual material or the fairy story with that substance to it. But I think he's thinking the masses, they prefer the food. So even as he's weaving perhaps some of these subtle critiques in there, he's expecting that the masses are going to sympathize with these characters and read the story on a very surface level, while perhaps these more aristocratic minds will pick up that he is critiquing Australian society.
It's a very interesting take. He's basically making fun of his reader as they're delighting stories.
Yeah, and I definitely wouldn't put that past Lindsay at all.
Yeah, well, if that's his intention, like you got to respect the fact that he's basically gotten away with that, right? So.
Yeah. Of course, I think there are some critiques in the book that are very obvious, and that is the critique of these sort of colonial instances of important societal institutions, like the government and the law court. And you've got this scene in, is it Fourth Slice? Because of course the book is not divided in chapters; it's divided into slices.
It is Fourth Slice. It's the experience in the town of Tooraloo. Classic bush name there.
Yeah, and you've got this send up of these two characters, the mayor of Tooraloo, and then this cowardly constable that's hanging around him. And this is, I think, making pretty clearly and obviously making fun of authority in colonial Australian society. But there's been this struggle over the pudding, between the pudding thieves and the noble pudding owners, and the constable and the mayor have come out. And the mayor says, "Well, it's very clear that somebody has to be arrested," said the mayor. "I can't be put to the trouble of wearing my robes of office in public without somebody having to pay for it. I don't care whether you arrest the top hat batterers or the battered top hatterers. All I say is do your duty, whatever happens. So somebody, no matter who, you must arrest or rue it. As I'm the mayor of Tooraloo and you've the painful job to do, I call on you to do it." "Oh, very well," said the constable peevishly. "As I've got to take all the responsibility, I'll settle the matter by arresting the pudding. As far as I can see, he's the ringleader in this disturbance." "You're a carrot-nosed poltroon," said the pudding loudly. "As for the mayor, he's a sausage-shaped porous plaster," and he gave him a sharp pinch in the leg. "What a ferocious pudding," said the mayor, turning as pale as a turnip. "Officer, do your duty and arrest this dangerous felon before he perpetrates further sacrilegious acts." "That's all very well, said the constable, turning as pale as tripe, "but he might nip me." "I can't help that," cried the mayor angrily. "At all costs, I must be protected from danger. Do your duty and arrest this felon with your hat." It's really quite ridiculous, isn't it?
It is, and it's aided by the illustrations. It's a shame that our listeners don't have access to those. The illustration over the page of the cowardly constable attempting to scoop up the pudding in his hat is really quite something. So, by this stage as well, it's also reached ridiculous levels, just how often characters are breaking into verse. That's actually the sheer frequency of it, I think, becomes part of the humour eventually, and with characters such as these, that's perhaps sending up the fact that they're speaking in this grand and stately manner. sending up their air of self-importance as well, perhaps. But yeah, it's very, very funny.
Yeah, it is good stuff. And the other one is the send up of the judge, because of course they have to go before a judge in a court to decide the matter of who is the rightful owner of the pudding, and the judge and his what is it, the porter.
The usher.
The usher, thank you. Yes, they have got the pudding in the meantime, and they're eating it while they're drinking port and having a game of cards. So really, it's quite ridiculous, and there's also a bit of scorn for lawyers in some of the story as well. What have we got? I might read out one bit. I didn't actually pick any bits from this, but the book is actually great. So yeah, it's really not just a book for kids, as we were saying earlier. Adults can quite a lot out of it.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to pick highlights, isn't it? There's something on every page that sort of laugh out loud. So, but yeah, I think Bill Barnacle, in the absence of any lawyer, becomes the lawyer for the prosecution, the barrister for the prosecution, and dons a wig. And then again, the illustration, an important element in the humour. He looks quite ridiculous in his barrister's wig. Does Bill Barnacle?
Yeah, the illustrations really are excellent. Oh, here across the page 154, we've got this bizarre thing as well, where the constable feeds the mayor bananas as well. What's this? So where we got, there was some delay before the proceedings began, for Bill said, "Here's me, the Crown prosecutor, without a wig. This will never do." Fortunately, a wig was found in the judge's private room, and Bill put it on with great satisfaction. "I'm afraid this is unconstitutional," said the mayor to the constable. "It is unconstitutional," said the constable, "but it's better than getting a punch on the snout." The mayor turned so pale at this that the constable had to thrust a banana into his mouth to restore his courage. "Thank you," said the mayor peevishly, "but on the whole, I prefer to be restored with peeled bananas." "Order in the jury box," said Bill sharply, and the mayor, having hurriedly bolted his banana peel, and all proceedings commenced. And in the image as well, there's almost a kind of sexual connotation to that. Would you say?
It's more than a little suggestive. Yeah. So to listeners, if you can get your hands on a copy of the book, page 100 is where the illustration in question is. But yes, the constable is feeding a banana, skin and all, to the mayor, and the mayor really seems to be getting into the act of it, we say.
Yeah. So really, what is the insinuation here, that these authorities are all cowardly, stuck up, and potentially homosexual?
It's pretty obvious. The question is, on the subject of some of the verses that are recited by these figures of authority, do we throw out the judge's poem on page 164 in response to the suggestion from Bunyip Bill that he's being poisoned by the pudding? He hasn't, in fact. It's all a ruse, but Bunyip Bill has said that he's been poisoned, and the judge blamed... Bunyip Bluegum. Yeah. He says the pudding's been poisoned. The judge blames it on the usher for
yes, this is a classic. I think you'd better read this
one. Forced him to consume 7 times. Now, for reasons that I'll leave for the listener to determine, some editions of the Magic Pudding don't contain all of this poem. Fortunately, mine is the unabridged version.
As is mine.
Wonderful. So, I better give the full context and read the usher's verse first. Yeah. So, Bunyip Bluegum gets up to announce that the pudding has been poisoned. Now, both usher and judge have been completely uninterested in proceedings up to this point. Some commentary there, not only on the corruption of the court, but the laziness, their unwillingness to do their jobs. And so this is why Bill has had to try the case in front of a jury of the mayor and the constable. But Bunyip Bluegum gets the attention of the judge and the usher by announcing that the pudding has been poisoned. And the usher says, or if, said the usher in a quavering voice, "If you take a poisoned pudding and that poison pudding chew, the sensations that you suffer, I should rather say, were due to the poison in the pudding in the act of poisoning you. And I think the fact suffices through this dreadfulest of crimes, as you've eaten 7 slices, you've been poisoned 7 times. It was your idea having it up on the bench, said the judge angrily to the usher. Now, if what you say is true, that idea you'll sadly rue. The poison I have eaten is entirely due to you. It's by taking your advice that I've had my 7th slice, and I'll tell you what I'll do, you unmitigated Jew. As a trifling satisfaction, why, I'll beat you black and blue. And with that, he hit the usher a smart crack on the head with a port bottle. That probably speaks for itself, doesn't it?
Yeah. Why would that ever be censored?
Yeah, very, very strange. Hard to wrap your head around it. But anyway.
But again, apart from that interesting little insult there, you do still, again, have the theme of obsession with food and fast resort to violence as well, because, of course, the usher and the judge have been digging into the pudding the whole time, which, as you said, was what was the reason why they were sort of shirking their duty. And then the judge is pretty quick to crack the usher on the head with the port bottle. So that is interesting. It sort of runs through the whole book. I mean, because the nature of the violence is so comedic, it doesn't necessarily stand out, obviously, as perhaps as obvious a theme as it is, but it really runs all the way through. I do think that is that influence of having been written right around the time or the end of World War.
But I mean, that's what good social commentary or satire should be, right? You don't want to be bludgeoned over the head with it so that you're not left with anything other than that. That's why when I was, yes, I must confess, I was once a libertarian. When I was a libertarian, I never enjoyed Atlas Shrugged. I hated it because it's a terrible book. Even if you're a libertarian, and even if you totally agree with the philosophy, which at one time I did, the characters are just so wooden. They say things that no real person would ever say because they're there to be a mouthpiece of ideas rather than to actually represent something resembling a real person in the real world. So you don't want good social commentary or social critique to get in the way of a good story, or in the case of The Magic Pudding, a funny story. You can strip all that analysis away and you're just left with a really funny story about a regenerating and an aristocratic koala.
Yeah. We might get to the end of the story then, and then I might let you indulge yourself with a few more verses that you select.
Sounds good.
But here we go, 168. So we get to this point where the story is coming to an end. And interestingly, Norman Lindsay sort of breaks the fourth wall here as well and directly addresses the audience. So let's have a look at. So they've just run out of town. So, and now, said Bill, when they had run a mile or two beyond the town, and now for some brilliant plan, swiftly conceived, which will put a stop to this puddin'-snatching business forever. For the point is, continued Bill, lowering his voice, here we are pretty close up to the end of the book, and something will have to be done in a tremendous hurry, or else we'll be cut off short by the cover. The solution is perfectly simple, said Bunyip. We have merely to stop wandering along the road, and the story will stop wandering through the book. This, too, will baffle the puddin' thieves, for while we wander along the road, our puddin' is exposed to the covetous glances of every passing puddin'-snatcher. Let us, then, remove to some safe, secluded spot, and settle down to a life of gaiety, dance, and song, where no puddin' thief will dare to show a sacrilegious head. Let us, in fact, build a house in a tree, for mark the advantages of such a habitation. Up on high, no neighbours pry in at the window on the sly. Up in a tree, you're always free from bores and bailiffs, you'll agree. Up on high, bricks you shy at bores and bailiffs passing by. Up in the leaves, one never grieves over the pranks of puddin' thieves. If you would be gay and free, take my tip and live in a tree. We will, shouted the puddin' owners. But the puddin' said sourly, this is all very well, all this highfalutin. But what about the dreadful news of me being poisoned at 10:30 this morning? You ain't poisoned, Albert, said Bill. That was only a mere ruse de guerre, as they say in the newspapers. A what? Demanded the puddin' suspiciously. Let words be sufficient without explanation, said Bill severely. And as we haven't got time to waste talking philosophy to a puddin', why into the bag he goes, or we'll never get the story finished. And anyway, they build the treehouse, and again, the picture is excellent. And in fact, Norman Lindsay goes to the trouble of telling us so. He says the picture opposite saves the trouble of explaining how they built it and what a splendid house it is. In order the puddin' might have plenty of exercise, they made him a little puddin' paddock, whence he can shout rude remarks to the people passing by, a habit I grieve to say is very prone to. and they merrily live onwards evermore in the treehouse, eating pudding. So it says, on winter nights there is always pudding and hot coffee for supper, and many's the good going I've had up there sitting around the fire. And they all have bells singing choruses from this made up story, Salt Junk Sarah, which there's excerpts of throughout the book. It's a recurring little thing. I don't know what would you call that, being a resident expert in literature.
Oh well, it's almost like a sea shanty, I think, that just keeps appearing and seems to never end. There are always new verses to be added. So yeah, I'd probably class it as a sea shanty that Bill Barnacle keeps returning to. But maybe also worth stating that the tree house that they ultimately end up living in is in a tree in the market garden of the elderly dog Benjamin Brandy Snap, who assists them in the second half of their quest to recover their pudding, and he's then present for the trial. And he doesn't seem particularly enamored with the idea of them setting up shop in a tree in his market garden. But Bill basically says, no, it'll be fine, it'll be great. And they basically force themselves on Benjamin Brandy Snap. So I don't know if there's any significance to that as well in our commentary on the pudding owners, that they kind of force themselves upon poor old Benjamin Brandy Snap.
And in the picture, they're all sitting there on the deck of the tree house. It's kind of a typical little bush house up there in the tree, weatherboard with a corrugated iron roof, and then it's got an Australian flag on the top. And then you've got a plank over to another branch where the pudding is stuck in its little pudding panic. And yeah, they're all having tea or coffee, rather, I suppose, as the book says. And they've got their legs up and they're just sitting around eating pudding. So is that the happy ending for Australia, for society? We have it pretty good, and we're just going to sit there and eat from our regenerating pudding.
Well, I don't know. Here we are, over 100 years later. What do you reckon? How's it all panned out?
I think there may have been a bit of a problem there, that we were a bit complacent. And that's the thing. People often talk about the idea that we're the lucky country, right? Forgetting that I think the phrase "the lucky country" was also generated as a critique of Australian apathy and lack of vision as to the problems we need to face. Now, was it Donald Horne that came up with that phrase?
Yeah, it was. It was Donald Horne, journalist. And,
now, I don't want to give the listener the impression that Donald Horne was a good guy. He was, I believe, he was part of the pro-immigration crowd, and his idea was, we're the lucky country. We're just sitting back and enjoying ourselves and not realizing that we actually need infinity immigration from the subcontinent.
Yes, that's right. But a broken clock is right twice a day, as they say, and at least in very general terms, the idea that we've basically gotten ourselves into the position that we were, the position of prosperity, largely through dumb luck and kind of stumbling onto a continent that was incredibly rich in natural resources rather than innovating. There may have been an element of merit to that. His solution was just dreadfully, dreadfully wrong. But yes, it was absolutely intended derisively, the term "the lucky country." Donald Horne said his biggest regret was that he ever came up with it so that it could be misused by politicians to say, "Oh, look, we should be so grateful that we live in a lucky country," not how it was intended to be used at all.
Yeah, and that's the kind of interesting that phrase, that the idea that may be intended as a critique that's then embraced by the perhaps bogan, unaware mainstream Australian culture. Perhaps there's the magic pudding as well, although more intentional, I think, in my reading anyway, in Lindsay's case. Given that he doesn't expect ever that the masses will understand this. But I think, that initial promise of Bunyip Bluegum that perhaps he'll be led into philosophy it's literally said in the text, and I was wondering about that little mention on that, second last page, where they quite literally say to the pudding, right? What was it, Bill? Let words be sufficient without explanation, said Bill severely, as we haven't got time to waste talking philosophy to a pudding. But by the end of it, of course, when they're just sitting in the tree, they have nothing but time to perhaps talk philosophy, but all they're doing is eating pudding and wasting away their time. So yeah, I think
Indeed.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
I'll let you go on and perhaps pick a few things or go where you
well,
want.
just a quick side note on that sketch. It's obviously in black and white as the sketches throughout the text are, but the shading on the section around the Union Jack versus the shading on the rest of that flag sitting on top of their little treehouse there looks, it creates the suggestion of a different colour. So I can only assume that they're flying the red ensign. So that's pretty cool, and I just wanted to make that observation. I'm definitely a red ensign appreciator. But look, we've already read the judges' rant against the usher.
Yeah.
And that was one that I wanted to tick off. Probably the other one, because as I said, I did read this quite recently for the purpose of this podcast. And the other moment that I really did have a good hearty chuckle at was, I think it's early in, is it in slice 3? I think it's early on in slice 3. It is. So they've recovered their pudding from the pudding thieves for the first time. The pudding thieves, in the first instance, managed to steal the pudding by pretending that there was a fire and masquerading as firemen. But it's sowed the seeds of doubt and mistrust into Bill Barnacle, and he just feels that he can't trust anybody, and he feels that anyone that he encounters might be a pudding thief in disguise. And so his solution is basically to accost everyone that he meets. And unfortunately, one of those people happens to be poor old Uncle Wattlebury, the man who's magnificent, the koala bear whose magnificent whiskers, which kept getting in the soup, are the reason for Bunyip Bluegum setting off in the first place. He just couldn't stand the feeling of claustrophobia that came with having to live alongside those whiskers. So I'm on page 92 now, and he's just taken hold of Uncle Wattlebury's whiskers, has Bill Barnacle, believing that he could be Wombat in disguise with his fake beard. I've got him, shouted Bill. Catch a hold of his other leg and give me a chance to get his whiskers off. But why are you taking his whiskers off? Inquired Bunyip Bluegum. Because they're stuck on with glue, shouted Bill. I saw it at a glance. It's Watkin Wombat, Esquire, disguised as a company promoter. Dear me, said Bunyip hurriedly. You are making a mistake. This is not a pudding thief. This is an uncle. A what? Exclaimed Bill, letting go of the whiskers. An uncle, replied Bunyip Bluegum. An uncle, roared Uncle Wattlebury. An uncle of the highest integrity. You have most disgracefully and unmercifully pulled an uncle's whiskers. I can assure you, said Bill, I pulled them under the delusion that you was a disguised wombat. That is no excuse, sir, bellowed Uncle Wattlebury. No one but an unmitigated ruffian would pull an uncle's whiskers. Who but the basest scoundrel double-dyed would pluck an uncle's whiskers in their pride? What baseness, then, doth such a man disclose, who'd raise a hand to pluck an uncle's nose? If I've gone too far, said Bill, I apologise. If I'd known you was an uncle, I wouldn't have done it. Apologies are totally inadequate, shouted Uncle Wattlebury. And we skip over the page, and Uncle Wattlebury is in such a rage that he says the only thing that's going to ease his anger is to plunge and bound, which seems to be a rather fancy way of saying jump up and down with rage. And thereupon did Uncle Wattlebury proceed to bound and plunge with the greatest activity, shouting all the while, you need not think I bound and plunge like this in festive mood. I bound that bounding may expunge the thought of insult rude. An uncle's rage must seek relief. His anger must be drowned. It is to soothe an uncle's grief that thus I plunge and bound. I bound and plunge, I seethe with rage, my mighty anger seeks so much relief that I engage to plunge and bound for weeks. And this is just a classic example of what I've spoken about, where a lot of the humour lies. I think it's this incongruity between this grand, stately, and particularly here neoclassical kind of style. In that previous verse, at the risk of getting too technical, we've got heroic couplets. Iambic pentameter and that AABB rhyming scheme. That's the style of this neoclassical poetry of like an Alexander Pope, and like someone like an Alexander Pope, it pursues that same kind of humour by pairing trivial subject matter with this very high style. It's reminiscent of something like the Rape of the Lock, where this rather trivial incident is sort of treated like this enormous travesty and told in this grand style. And Uncle Wattleberry, he treats the fact that he's an uncle, as though he's a lord, as though that's some sort of title of significance, and vents his outrage in this very grand sort of style that's just totally at odds with what he's actually saying. It's very fun. I love this book.
Yeah, and one of the things I really love is how well Lindsay does the characterization, not just through the pictures, but through the text and the change of register in the way the different characters speak. It's just the way that he roars, right? An uncle of the highest integrity. You have most disgracefully and unmercifully pulled an uncle's whiskers. Yes, that kind of speech. And then, Bill, pulling your nose, said Bill solemnly, is a mistake any man might make, for I put it to all present as a man to man, if that nose don't look as if it's only gummed on.
It's a really good observation. He does. He has, amid the ridiculousness of it all, he has a really fine sense of character and getting that shift. And there's the register of the dialogue itself, but then, as I said, that very high, grand sort of style, that kind of verse that meter is specifically reserved for Bunyip Bluegum and Uncle Wattleberry. That's not actually used. It's more of that kind of ballad type meter that's used for the lower characters, if you like, and to reflect their lower social standing. So it's very, very clever.
It is just an excellent book. And to reiterate what I said, I think right at the start, I think it's so important to expose children to good children's literature like this.
Absolutely.
Just through the hearing of it and through some bit of good young osmosis, they can pick up a bit of culture.
Absolutely.
All right. Anything else we want to talk about? I think we've kind of not exhausted the full potential of this book, because it's pretty much pure gold on every page. But we have probably talked about pretty much everything we wanted to, at least on my part.
Yeah, I probably better stop myself there, Nick, because I could go on all night, and that's not really something that I should be doing.
But to conclude, have you been sold the idea that this is that underlying all of these adventures, there is this subtle critique of Australian society and its sort of lucky country attitude?
I was definitely somewhat convinced coming into the show. There were a few points that I sort of thought, I'm not so sure about that. But I must admit, I've become more convinced as the show's worn on. Just certain extracts from creative effort and you kind of clarifying this Nietzschean perspective and some of the subtleties and nuances of that I maybe didn't quite fully grasp. I think I've come around to it more and more. And I must say, if he's kind of making fun of his readership while having them spellbound at the same time, well, hats off for that, because that's mean-spirited perhaps as that is, it's a pretty impressive achievement.
Yeah, whether it's mean-spirited or not, I mean, there is kind of, I suppose, a disdainful perhaps thing towards the masses. There is this again, I have a collection of quotes here, and maybe we'll read all of them, but from creative effort, I think I said a reasonable a little bit about it at the biographical sketch section, but just a bit more from Norman Lindsay's son on how much of a philosophical man his father was. It wasn't really Norman wasn't really a philosophical man at all. So he was pretty much philosophically illiterate, but it just happened that he had picked up this book by Nietzsche, and I think it was Thus Spake Zarathustra, probably the main book of Nietzsche's, one of the main expressions of his thought. Not one that I'm actually particularly familiar with. I'm more familiar with Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morality and so on. But Lindsay said that Norman was pretty much philosophically illiterate, and he'd pretty much just picked up this Nietzsche book from, I think it was Cole's Book Arcade, which you may know of. Are you familiar with Cole's Book Arcade?
Cole's Book Arcade? No.
We'll have to go back and
a blank on that.
We'll have to go back and do. I could be wrong about him picking it up there, but it was. If you've ever been in Melbourne, and I know you have, in the different arcades and stuff, well, one of them used to be basically this huge bookshop, and it was kind of a center of all these, obviously books, but different texts. And Cole himself was a man who was part of that sort of free thought atheistic humanist movement in that atmosphere. So a sort of dissident kind of out there thinking. So anyway, we'll have to do a show on it at some point. But yeah,
This is a
Jack
bit of a
later
gap in my
apparently,
knowledge. So.
Jack apparently later introduced Lindsay to Plato as well, and I've heard that Lindsay's later thought is more Neoplatonist influenced. Again, judging from creative effort, it's very much an artist, or it's the sort of thing I call like literature professor philosophy, where they kind of get the vague idea of a philosophical text without really perhaps understanding any argumentation, but they have this sort of impressionistic adaptation of it or adaptation of it. That's what I would say this book would be. But Lindsay himself, page 14 to 15 of the book, talks about how he received Nietzsche. He says, "We owe to Nietzsche the understanding that the human valuation is physiological as well as psychological. We owe to him the knowledge that the aristocratic standard is fixed by nature, that the higher impulse lives by necessity also. Here for the first time was affirmed the aristocracy of beauty, gaiety, uprightness. All that goes on light feet. Wherever the clarity of Nietzsche's vision rested, it penetrated all that is tawdry and pretentious in the structure of human morality, behind which mankind muddles an aimless course between his primitive fear of cold hunger and darkness and the retribution of his own tribal laws. To the tottering fabric of Christianity, he delivered a gigantic blow from which there is no recovery for that debased creed." Apologies to Christians in the audience. But yes, obviously Nietzsche is probably the greatest critic of Christianity, I would say. But yeah, definitely very positive towards that side of Nietzsche that celebrates art, that beauty, gaiety, that sort of clever attitude.
Yeah, well, as much as I haven't gone down a Nietzschean path, and maybe for obvious reasons, being Christian myself, I feel like I'm at least in good company in terms of, my own understanding of philosophy is very impressionistic and not at all grounded in any kind of understanding of classical principles of argumentation or the broader history of philosophy. So knowing that Norman Lindsay of a similar ilk makes me feel a bit better about myself. But knowing that there's this later Neoplatonist side to Lindsay, well, I imagine you've got a series of episodes lined up on that, Mick. So we'll look forward to hearing about it.
If I can ever get a hold of his later book, Scribblings of an Idle Mind, then I might know something about it beyond a passing remark in I think an academic paper.
I'll keep an eye out.
What I suspect is basically that this duality that he's begun with, that he started with from Nietzsche, where he says he's got this idea of mere existence, and obviously Nietzsche himself is not about will to survive or just this idea of just trying to stay alive. Nietzsche goes beyond that and saying, no, the driving force behind the organism is the will to power and expressing itself over and against other the world, or and I think that's where one of the things that Lindsay would have really liked about Nietzsche's work, this idea of that self-expression and that subjective creation of values, right? Value creating impulse, right? Creative effort is the name of his text. But then this sort of split between that mere existence of the plebs who just eat the pudding, and then the life of the mind of the poet and the artist. I can see how that could lead in a Neoplatonic direction, where you're elevating mind, over putting a more metaphysical slant on it that Nietzsche, ironically, was reacting against. But I don't think that Lindsay ever would have concerned himself with the details of that kind of philosophical detail and argumentation and what precisely are they arguing. I just the parts of the text of creative effort that I have read are very much more impressionistic and almost an expression of just Lindsay being perhaps his frustration with the mass. I think a lot of people with that artistic talent do need to be, or do find the need to express, I don't know what word you would say, but frustration or irritation at how tasteless the masses are. They're sports ball, eat a meat pie and peas, mate. Whereas, and they don't have any real interest in all these ideas that you have.
I like the ideas. I just like my sports ball as well. I'll make the claim that Australian rules football, and got guys in the organisation from those states north of the Barassi line that are going to be rolling their eyes listening to this. But Australian rules football, we're advancing Australian culture. It's one of the main expressions of Australian culture, despite what the Australian Football League does to try to destroy the game. That the game itself survives. So I like to think we can eat our cake and have it too. That we can enjoy the bread and circuses and the sports ball of the masses, but also try to elevate ourselves to that higher culture and time.
I was just going to say, one of my favourite things to do is to travel around little country towns or bigger country towns even, and go into all the secondhand bookstores and have a look for cheap and yet rare and interesting texts on Australian ideas and history and all sorts of things. And I have just recently picked up a book by Geoffrey Blaney about the origin and history of Australian football. So
is it called A Game of Our Own?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, great book. Yeah, highly recommend.
Perhaps that's a show that can come up at some point.
no doubt. And if the Neoplatonic perspectives of Norman Lindsay get any airtime at any stage, Mick, I'll be happy to come back on the show.
And for it. Are you familiar with Bruce Dorr?
I am familiar with Bruce Dorr, but I must admit that compared to some of our other poets, I'm not as familiar with his work. But yes,
he's got a good football poem that basically parodies football as kind of a civic religion or a religion surrogate for Australians. So I'm
not sure I can really argue with that. But no, yeah. Would be more than happy to discuss that in a later episode. And if you're going to discuss Neoplatonism and Lindsay, well, once again, you can do the heavy lifting, and I'll just come back on and talk some more about the magic pudding.
Yep. All right. Well, let's finish off with one last quote from Creative Effort, and we'll let Lindsay speak for himself there and wrap it up. So, page 32. The aristocratic affirmation. To state in plain terms that the creative effort marks the highest achievement of man is to state an aristocratic value. And if it can be understood that the creative effort expresses a spiritual and a moral development which goes beyond life on earth, then the artist, the poet, the musician, and the thinker are already the aristocrats of the future. Such a statement deserves to rouse the anger of all common minds. What? Common minds by the million, and this handful of writers and artists to claim precedence? To claim for themselves the meaning of life, the reward of futurity? Execration on such vile egotism. Is it not sufficient that we buy their pictures, read their poems, applaud their music, make a state which gives them an opportunity to practice their art, that they should take our money, our patronage, our appreciation even, and climb over our heads with all? If the reward of futurity is for them, that handful, what is our reward? The reward for us, the million. There you go.
What indeed.
Yeah. Let us know in the comments what topics you'd like to hear about from us, or if there is a particular topic relating to Australia or the ANA that you would like us to do a show on. As always, I'd encourage all our supporters in the audience to make sure you like and subscribe and share our content far and wide. We'd love to share our show with as many good Aussies as possible. Lastly, if you want to reach out, as always, you can find us at ausnatives.org, AUSNATIVES.org. And that's Mitch and Mick, or Mick and Mitch, signing out.
You wait till you see the stuff. Look, it's all coming now. I never thought I'd live to see this. It's only the last 3 or 4 years that suddenly my faith has been absolutely established.
Who were the influences that worked upon you as an artist in your youth, Mr. Lindsay?
Oh, I went to 2. Dürer and Rubens. You have to fix your faith somewhere. You see, you've got to start off from some point. Start off thinking from a certain point. Do you want some more of this?
Yes, I'd love some.
Well, it's this. You've got to find a direction. When I was a kid of 17, it was in Pole's Book Arcade. I saw a little tray of books, one small, cheap covers, shilling editions. There was Zarathustra, Nietzsche's Zarathustra. I picked it up. I opened it. And I read, "Are you one who goes alone or one who goes with the mob? This is my way, which is yours. The way exists not." Then there were aphorisms. I could only believe in a God I knew how to dance. When I found my devil, he was the spirit of gravity. All wells are poisoned with a rebel drink. Magnificent stuff. Oh, good to be hid like wine. Well, I found my direction. This is all the sort of thought I wanted to think, you see. Well, there it is. Apparently, the stuff I don't know, I've forgotten creative effort, but apparently there's stuff in that these kids wanted to think. Well, they wouldn't go and pick it up, you see. It's made a complete curve. From the day I picked up Nietzsche as a boy of 17 to the present moment when these lads are coming along and wanting to talk to me. Very flattering.
Are you still painting with the same basic ideas now as you were then?
Yes, I keep my faith in life the same way. It's a simple thing. There are two views from life. Look, there is to affirm life or deny it. I affirm life, that is. I affirm life as being a magnificent adventure. I affirm it by all that's damnable in it, because that's the test of endurance. But the people who say no to life, well, they are the weight, the dead weight that the people who say affirm life have got to carry. But it's a good thing. You've got conflict. You must have conflict. You can't have it all your own way.
That's true. Where do you get the inspiration for the present work that you're doing? Is it...
Well, it's very hard to say, you know. I don't know how a poet gets an image, but I know that an image always forms in my mind automatically, just an image, it's always a single figure, and I jot it down on a bit of paper, and then a picture grows out of it, and then I find what the picture's about after I've drawn it. That's the way it works with me. You can't analyse it. It's a queer process. But mind you, it's a lifelong job. You dare not leave it for a minute.